Welcome to Quick Speak, the English podcast. Today we're going to talk about something many people are thinking about right now.
Yeah.
This feeling that their work, the job they do every day, just doesn't feel important or purposeful.
It's a feeling that affects so many, isn't it? A real disconnect between the time and energy we spend working
Yeah,
and the sense that we're actually achieving something meaningful.
absolutely. In this podcast, we're going to look at this modern problem. Why does work feel meaningless for so many today? We'll explore the history of work, the pressures people feel now, and maybe, just maybe, some different ways of thinking about work for the future.
Okay.
Think of this as a helpful discussion to understand this complex topic and hopefully learn some useful English vocabulary along the way.
Sounds good. Let's maybe start by looking back in time a bit. Work hasn't always been experienced the way it is today, you know?
Right.
If you go back to pre-industrial times, like before the big factories appeared, work was very much just part of life itself.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It was connected to family, to the community, even to the seasons, like farming.
Exactly. People
Yeah.
crafted things by hand, they grew food, they cared for animals. It wasn't this separate scheduled activity like we often think of it now.
So your daily tasks were directly linked to, say, feeding your family or helping your neighbors.
And as skilled crafts developed, things like carpentry or weaving, people took real pride in their specific trade, you know? There was a craft identity.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then came the Industrial Revolution, starting in the late 1700s. That must have been a huge shift.
Oh, it completely changed everything. Work moved into factories, schedules became very strict, the clock suddenly ruled your life.
Right.
And labor, well, started to be treated simply as something to be bought and sold, almost like a raw material.
So instead of making a whole shoe with skill, maybe you just do one tiny repetitive task all day, every single day, in a noisy, often dangerous factory.
Precisely. The work often became unskilled, physically very hard, and you lost that direct connection to a finished product or even your community in the same way.
And this loss of connection and, well, dignity, that was a big reason why early labor movements started, wasn't it?
Absolutely. People weren't just asking for better pay, they were demanding to be treated like human beings, not just, parts in a machine. They wanted their work to have some value beyond just making money for the factory owner.
Okay. So fast forward a bit to the 20th century, and things shifted again.
Yeah, definitely. With the rise of more office jobs, white-collar work, and a growing economy, the idea of a job for life became pretty common for a while.
Right, I've heard about that. And companies sometimes felt like a kind of second family.
For some people, yes. Work became really strongly tied to your identity and your social status, like, climbing the career ladder, earning enough to buy a house. Those were major goals.
You worked hard, and the idea was that your effort would lead to clear progress, visible success.
That was the ideal, yes. But then, as the global economy changed, especially in the late 20th century, with factories closing in some areas, jobs moving to different countries, those old promises started to feel, well, less certain.
Ah, okay. And that's when questions about the real value of work, the inherent purpose, really started to bubble up more widely.
Exactly. For many people, work stopped feeling like a clear path to security or status, and it became a source of uncertainty and even, frustration about what the point of it all was.
This whole historical change, it sounds like it's deeply connected to how we think about work, like from a moral or maybe even a spiritual perspective.
It really is.
You hear about the idea of the Protestant work ethic. Can you maybe explain that simply for us?
Sure. So this idea, which became quite influential, particularly in Western societies, was linked to certain religious beliefs, especially within Protestantism. The thinking was, roughly, that hard work and economic success weren't just about making money. They could actually be seen as a sign that you were favored by God. Diligence in your job was almost a moral duty, a vocation or calling.
So for a long time, work had this sort of built-in moral meaning. It was seen as a virtuous activity in itself.
Exactly. That was a powerful framework. But as societies became less focused on traditional religion, particularly through the 20th century, that religious framing for work started to fade.
And it was replaced with something different, right?
Yeah.
Instead of work being mainly a moral duty, the focus shifted more towards finding personal fulfillment through work.
That's right. Ideas from psychology became really popular. The whole concept of self-actualization, using work for personal growth, for creativity, feeling independent or autonomous.
And here's where the puzzle comes in, maybe.
Yeah.
This new focus, this idea that work needs to fulfill your personal passion or your deep values, that sets really high expectations, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. If your job isn't just about paying the bills or, doing your duty, but it's supposed to be about achieving personal fulfillment, well, that puts a lot of pressure on the job itself.
Yeah.
Precisely. And when work doesn't deliver that deep personal meaning, you don't just feel a little unhappy, you can feel genuinely disillusioned. Like something important was promised but wasn't delivered.
It's hard to feel purposeful if your job doesn't align with that personal quest for meaning.
Exactly. And that feeling of disillusionment is often made worse by how unstable many careers feel today. Jobs for life are pretty rare now.
Right. Companies get bought and sold, people get laid off unexpectedly.
Yes, that constant uncertainty about the future of your job,
Hmm.
it fuels this broader sense of meaninglessness for some people. If your connection to a company or even a type of work feels fragile, why invest your whole sense of self or purpose in it?
Work starts to feel more like a temporary transaction, maybe, not a source of deep, lasting worth.
That's a good way to put it. And this feeling of frustration and disconnect also has a big impact on our well-being. The psychological side of this is really serious, especially when we talk about burnout.
Burnout, yes, that's a word we hear a lot now.
It is,
Hmm.
and the World Health Organization officially recognized burnout back in 2019 as a problem specifically connected to work.
Okay, and what does it involve?
Well, it's generally understood as feeling completely exhausted, becoming cynical or negative about your job, and feeling like you're less effective at what you do. It really shows the cost of constant stress, impossible expectations, and maybe not having enough control over your work.
And the statistics are quite striking, aren't they? I read somewhere that worldwide, only about 20% of employees feel truly engaged in their work.
Just think about that for a moment. Only 1 in 5 people you might meet feels genuinely plugged into their job. That's a huge number of people who likely feel disconnected, just sort of going through the motions. It's not just mild dissatisfaction. It's a massive area where people potentially feel their effort is.
Well, pointless. If you don't feel connected, how can you feel purposeful?
So, what causes burnout beyond just working long hours? Is it more complex than that?
It often is. Research suggests it's frequently about a deep mismatch, a conflict between a person's own values and the work they have to do every day.
Okay.
Or if you don't have much control over how you do your job, or maybe you feel your manager doesn't really support you, trust disappears.
And that lack of trust and control makes you doubt if your work has any real point, right?
Yeah.
Which could definitely add to feelings of anxiety or even depression.
Exactly. And what's particularly interesting or maybe worrying is how this can be made worse by what people call hustle culture.
Hustle culture, that idea you see everywhere, maybe especially online, that you should be working all the time,
Yeah.
glorifying being constantly busy, equating long hours with success. That's the one. It's that sort of romantic idea of sleep when you're dead, pushing yourself to the absolute limit constantly.
Right.
But the research actually shows that to perform well and sustainably over time, people need rest. They need some control over their work, some autonomy, and they need to feel psychologically safe and supported in their workplace.
So you're kind of caught, aren't you, between this cultural message telling you to exhaust yourself and the reality that it's harmful to your health and might not even lead to better work in the long run.
It creates a real tension.
Yeah, and that leads to a very difficult question. If your job is making you feel constantly stressed or unwell, physically or mentally, why continue?
And these feelings aren't just psychological. They're often tightly connected to the economic realities people are facing.
Okay, so how do economic factors contribute to work feeling pointless?
Well, let's consider wages first. For many people, particularly those maybe without a university degree in countries like the US, wages haven't really grown much since the 1970s, even though the cost of living, things like housing, healthcare, education, has gone up significantly.
So you work hard, maybe even harder than people did before, but your life doesn't necessarily get easier or more secure. That could definitely feel incredibly pointless, couldn't it? Your effort doesn't seem to lead anywhere better.
It can feel like running just to stand still. Then there's the issue of inequality. The gap between the pay of top executives and the average worker has grown enormously.
I've seen some figures on that. Like in the US, CEOs earning hundreds of times more than the typical worker today, compared to maybe 20 times more a few decades ago.
Exactly. Seeing such huge differences can really damage morale. If you see a small group benefiting so much while many people working hard on the front lines are struggling to make ends meet, it's hard to feel like the system is fair.
Yeah, or that your own hard work will actually lead to financial security or, moving up in life.
And this feeling is often made worse by the rise of what's called precarious work.
Precarious work, like jobs that are temporary or part-time with uncertain hours, maybe 0 hours contracts, or even unpaid internships.
That's right. So you might be constantly worried about where your next paycheck is coming from. You might be juggling several different small jobs, often with no benefits like health insurance or paid time off, and certainly no job security.
That sounds incredibly stressful.
It is, and this situation tends to create a very short-term view of work. Why would you feel emotionally connected or invested in a job or a company when it offers you absolutely no stability or future?
Work just becomes about survival, maybe. Getting through the next week. It definitely fuels that feeling of why bother
Yeah.
beyond the immediate paycheck.
Exactly. And then technology adds another layer to this feeling of disconnection for many people.
How so? Automation and digital tools. They've made businesses more efficient in many ways.
Right. They have, but they've also changed or completely eliminated many jobs. Tasks that used to involve hands-on skills or maybe direct human interaction are now often done by computers or software.
Can you give an example?
Sure, think about assembly line workers being replaced by robots, or maybe administrative assistants whose traditional tasks like scheduling or filing are now handled by software programs. People can feel like their skills are becoming old-fashioned or just unnecessary very quickly.
Yeah, your effort feels less valued when a machine could potentially do it faster or cheaper.
Or when the nature of the job changes so much it doesn't resemble what you were trained for. Then there's the gig economy, using apps for jobs like driving, delivering food, or doing small tasks.
Right, platforms like Uber or TaskRabbit, they offer some flexibility, which people like.
True, but they often lack the benefits, the security, and importantly, that feeling of belonging that more traditional jobs sometimes offered.
So when your work is broken down into these small, separate tasks you pick up through an app, it must be hard to build a professional identity. Or see how your small task fits into something bigger.
Very difficult. Each job is just the next item on a list, really, not necessarily part of a larger mission or a team effort.
And digital connectivity,
Uh,
the feeling that we're always on, always available through email, messages, Slack. That plays a role too, doesn't it?
Definitely. We were sort of told that technology would give us more freedom, but for many people, it feels like it means work never truly stops. The boundaries just blur completely.
Yeah.
And this brings up an important point. When work becomes this never-ending stream of notifications and small tasks demanding immediate attention instead of, say, focused, meaningful challenges, how do you keep sight of any larger purpose?
You might just lose the why behind all the daily activity.
Exactly. You're just reacting all the time.
Speaking of how people see work, the discussion also highlights that younger generations, like millennials and Gen Z, often seem to have different perspectives compared to older ones.
Yes, that's a common observation. These generations largely grew up seeing economic difficulties, like the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. They might have seen parents or family members lose jobs or pensions shrink.
So maybe they became more skeptical about following a traditional step-by-step career path. The idea of the American dream, through steady work, perhaps feels less certain.
Perhaps. Their priorities can be different. They often seem to value flexibility, finding work that feels purposeful, and having a good balance between work and the rest of their life, sometimes even more than just chasing the highest salary or climbing a single corporate ladder.
And they're often interested in having side hustles, right? Like extra jobs or projects.
Yeah, and not always just for more money, but sometimes because they want to explore their passions or interests outside of their main job. They tend to see work as one important part of life, but maybe not the only or most central defining thing.
And this can sometimes cause a bit of friction, can it? With older generations or traditional managers who might expect employees to show more company loyalty and work very long hours.
It really points to a cultural shift happening. Younger generations are often more comfortable questioning traditional work structures. They might feel that work arrangements should be more flexible and better aligned with their personal values.
So the old ways of working can feel kind of rigid or maybe even empty to them.
Potentially, yes. This leads us neatly into a concept that has really seemed to resonate with a lot of people recently. David Graeber's idea of bullshit jobs.
Ah, yes, I've heard of that book. What's the basic idea?
Well, Graeber argued that there are many jobs out there that even the people doing them feel are completely meaningless or unnecessary.
Really? Even the employees themselves think that?
That was his argument based on anecdotes he collected. He gave examples like certain roles in large corporations focused mainly on internal processes, or perhaps some administrative or marketing tasks that don't seem to produce anything tangible or valuable.
So jobs that seem to exist just to keep the bureaucracy going, maybe? Not because they create actual value for customers or society,
Mhm.
like make work jobs that don't really need to be done.
That's the essence of it. And this idea really strikes a chord with many people, especially those working in large organizations or maybe in certain service industries.
People describe spending their days in endless meetings, writing reports maybe no one reads,
Yeah.
or managing tasks that just feel like shuffling digital paper around.
Exactly. I remember reading an anecdote about someone feeling their entire job was just rearranging data in spreadsheets for meetings, and then the spreadsheets were immediately forgotten afterwards.
Wow. Yeah, when your main contribution feels like performing those kinds of unnecessary tasks, your sense of purpose must really suffer.
It seems likely. Now, there is some debate, of course. Some argue these jobs might serve some hidden function, perhaps helping large, complex organizations operate smoothly or providing social cohesion within the workplace.
Okay.
But the fact that so many people recognize this concept suggests there's a real hunger out there for work that feels like it makes a tangible difference, a real impact.
And then, of course, the whole world experienced a massive disruption with the COVID-19 pandemic, starting in early 2020. That must have been a major catalyst for rethinking work,
Oh, absolutely. It forced a revaluation for pretty much everyone. Millions of people suddenly had to work from home almost overnight.
right? And at the same time, other workers were labeled essential and had to continue working in person, often facing significant health risks, sometimes for relatively low pay.
Both of those experiences really shifted perspectives. People working from home discovered new flexibility, but also sometimes felt isolated or found it really hard to separate work life from home life.
And essential workers often felt, quite understandably, undervalued, despite the risks they were taking for the community.
For many, removing the daily commute was a revelation. It showed they could be just as productive, maybe even more so, working remotely. And it gave them back hours of personal time each day.
Missing important life events because of work suddenly seemed much more significant, maybe.
I think so. And companies were essentially forced to accept that remote and flexible work was possible on a much larger scale than many had previously believed.
This period also led to what people started calling the Great Resignation, around 2021 and 2022, where millions of people quit their jobs voluntarily.
That's right. The reasons for quitting were varied, of course, but the materials we looked at suggest it often wasn't just about finding a higher salary.
What else was driving it?
Many people left due to burnout, feeling morally uncomfortable with their company's practices, or simply having had time to reflect and wanting a job that felt more meaningful or offered a better work-life balance.
So money was still important, obviously, but maybe things like flexibility, feeling respected, and working for a company whose values matched their own became primary reasons for making a change.
It seems that way for many. People started asking themselves, if life feels uncertain and short, why should I stay in a job that drains my energy and feels pointless?
Yeah. The pandemic really threw existing problems with work into sharp focus, didn't it? And it definitely sped up conversations about changing work structures to better support people's well-being and maybe their sense of purpose.
It did. And this brings us to the role of company culture itself. The material strongly suggests that the culture within a company plays a critical role in whether people feel their work is meaningful or not.
How so?
Well, when companies seem to focus only on short-term profits and don't really invest in their employees' development or well-being, it tends to create mistrust.
Okay.
And leaders who seem disconnected or maybe who treat employees just as numbers on a spreadsheet that can really damage morale and any sense of shared purpose.
And bad management practices are unfortunately quite common, aren't they? Things like quiet hiring. What's that exactly?
Quiet hiring is basically when companies ask existing employees to take on new tasks and responsibilities, often without more pay or a promotion, simply because the company won't hire more people. It's making teams do more with less.
Okay. That doesn't sound great.
Or things like excessive monitoring of employees, maybe demanding answers late at night or on weekends practices that can feel very dehumanizing.
And micromanagement, where a manager controls every tiny detail of your work. That's a classic example, isn't it?
It is, because it sends a very clear message. We don't trust you. And this directly reduces your autonomy, that feeling of control and independence, which is actually really important for feeling personally motivated and connected to your work.
And even when companies try to do good things, like promoting diversity and inclusion, if it feels like it's just for show, kind of performative,
Mm-hmm.
employees can become quite cynical, right? They lose faith in the company's stated values.
Exactly. Though some companies are trying different approaches. The materials mention things like radical transparency, where information is shared much more openly within the company,
Okay.
or involving employees more in decision-making, even experimenting with alternative structures like holacracy. That's a system that tries to replace traditional management hierarchies with self-organizing teams.
Interesting. Do those work?
Well, these methods aim to empower employees and remove bottlenecks, but they can also be quite difficult to implement well. They often require a lot of support and training.
So the initial good idea could actually lead to new problems, like decision fatigue or confusion about who's responsible for what.
It can, yes, turning hope into a new kind of frustration if not managed carefully. The key factor really seems to be whether a company genuinely sees its employees as important partners in a shared goal.
Or just as resources to be managed for efficiency.
Precisely. Without that feeling of a shared vision and being valued as a contributor, work can easily feel like just ticking boxes, completing tasks, and meeting targets without any deeper meaning attached.
But as more people feel this sense of disillusionment, alternative ideas about work and purpose seem to be gaining more traction.
Yes, definitely. One area that's growing is the interest in purpose-driven careers, or working for organizations with a strong social or environmental mission.
So working for nonprofit organizations or maybe social businesses or startups that are specifically focused on solving problems like climate change or social inequality.
Exactly. The appeal is pretty clear. You feel like your daily work is directly contributing to a positive impact in the world.
Though, I guess there can be downsides too. Maybe lower salaries sometimes, or less stable funding compared to traditional corporate jobs.
That's often the trade-off, yes. People choosing these paths frequently have to balance their idealism and desire for impact with those practical financial concerns.
Okay, what other ideas are gaining attention? Universal basic income or UBI?
Yes, UBI. That's the concept of providing a regular, unconditional sum of money to every citizen, regardless of whether they are employed or not.
And the argument is,
Supporters argue this could decouple basic survival from needing a wage job. It might free people up to spend time on creative pursuits, caring for family members, volunteering, or getting further education.
but there are concerns too, right? Critics worry it might make people less motivated to work or about the very high cost of funding such a program for everyone.
Yes, those are the main counter-arguments. Pilot studies in different places have shown mixed results so far, and it's still a topic of much debate and ongoing research.
And another idea that seems very popular right now is the 4-day work week.
Extremely popular discussion point. Many companies and even some countries or regions have been running trials of this, often working 4 days instead of 5, but with no reduction in pay.
And what are the results like?
Well, trials in places like Iceland and the UK, among others, have often suggested that employees can maintain or even sometimes increase their productivity in those 4 days.
Really? Why would that be?
The thinking is that they are more rested, less stressed, and therefore more focused and motivated during their working hours.
That makes sense.
Supporters argue that having more rest and personal time leads to happier, healthier, more creative, and ultimately more dedicated workers. There are challenges, of course, especially for jobs in sectors that require constant service coverage.
Right.
But it's a really interesting example of trying to fundamentally reorganize work in a way that prioritizes people's well-being alongside the business goals. It asks, can we reduce that feeling of pointlessness, partly by just changing how we structure our working time and effort?
So we've covered a lot of ground. We've looked at the big historical shifts in how work is viewed, the psychological impact of feeling disconnected, those economic pressures like low wages and job insecurity.
And how technology is reshaping jobs, how younger generations might see work differently, that interesting idea of bullshit jobs.
Right. Plus the huge impact of the pandemic and the really critical role that company culture and management play in all of this.
Yeah, this discussion, drawing on the materials, really gives us a clearer picture, I think, of why so many people today are questioning the purpose and meaning of their work.
It really does. And it leaves us, and you listening, with something important to think about, doesn't it? As the meaning of work is clearly changing so much, what responsibility do we have, as individuals, but also companies and society as a whole, in finding or perhaps creating purpose in the future of work?
Or maybe, if work is no longer going to be the main thing that gives many people their identity, What else will fill that space in our lives?
Those are definitely big questions for the future.
They certainly are.
Well, thank you for joining us for Quick Speak. If you enjoyed this podcast and you want to keep improving your English listening and vocabulary, please do subscribe. You can also find more learning materials related to this episode, like vocabulary lists and maybe some exercises, over on our website. You'll find the link in the description of this podcast episode. Thanks so much for listening.